It was a night like any other inside the hospital ward, a place where time seemed to move slowly, with the rhythm of machines beeping and the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. The air carried a sterile stillness, a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. Patients, weakened by their conditions, lay in their beds under the dim glow of fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above. Some whispered in their sleep, others stared into the darkness with restless eyes. But as the clock pushed closer to midnight, something unusual began to happen, something that would bind each person in that ward together in ways no one could have ever imagined. One by one, they began to dream. At first, there was nothing strange about it, dreaming was natural. Yet these dreams felt different, vivid in a way that defied explanation. Each patient would later describe the same beginning, walking down a long, narrow hallway that seemed endless. The walls were lined with cracked tiles, the floor cold beneath their feet. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered, buzzing intermittently, as though electricity pulsed through a place not meant to be alive. Shadows danced just out of reach, giving the sense that something was watching, waiting. And at the far end of the hallway stood a figure. The figure was tall, indistinct, shrouded in shadows so thick the face could not be seen. But the presence was undeniable, heavy, commanding, oppressive. As the patients walked forward, some described a pull, as though invisible strings tugged at their chest, drawing them closer. Others recalled a voice, soft but urgent, whispering words that made no sense yet filled them with dread. It's time. When they awoke, most of them gasped for air, drenched in sweat, hearts pounding against fragile ribs. Some cried quietly, others sat frozen, staring into the dark room, too afraid to speak. But as morning came, a realization spread like wildfire. Each of them, every single patient in that ward, had dreamed the exact same thing. At first, nurses dismissed it as coincidence. Sick people, confined together in a hospital, sometimes shared anxieties that could slip into their subconscious. But then, details began to align too perfectly. Patients who had never spoken to each other described the same hallway, the same flickering lights, the same faceless figure waiting for them at the end. It was as though they had all been led into the same nightmare by unseen hands. Whispers filled the ward. Some laughed nervously, calling it a strange fluke. Others prayed quietly, clutching rosaries or repeating verses under their breath. But beneath the surface of those uneasy conversations was something heavier, a sense of dread no one dared say aloud. It wasn't just a dream. It felt like a warning. The head nurse, exhausted after a long shift, brushed off the stories at first. Yet by evening, when patient after patient repeated the same account, her skepticism began to falter. The descriptions were too precise, too consistent. She noted them down in her records, though unease tugged at her with every word she wrote. Later, she would recall a chill running down her spine as she realized something impossible: the dream wasn't confined to one person's mind. Somehow, it belonged to all of them. That night, as she switched off the lights and left the ward in eerie silence, the nurse paused at the doorway and looked back at the patients drifting into uneasy sleep. She would remember the moment vividly, the flicker of a light bulb, the way the shadows stretched unnaturally long across the floor. At the time, she told herself it was nothing. Just fatigue playing tricks on her. But in less than a week, every patient who shared that dream would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions and an emptiness that no investigation could ever fill. The countdown had already begun, though no one in that room knew it yet. The hospital itself was an old structure, standing with a kind of stubbornness against the passage of time. From the outside, it looked ordinary enough: faded beige walls, streaked windows that reflected dull light during the day and glowed faintly at night. But up close, one could sense something else, something woven into the fabric of the building. Its corridors carried the weight of countless stories: births, deaths, recoveries, and tragedies. The longer you spent inside, the more the walls seemed to whisper. This particular ward had always been set apart from the rest of the hospital. It wasn't just physically separated, tucked away on the fourth floor at the very end of a narrow corridor. it also had a reputation. Doctors rotated through reluctantly, nurses whispered about it during their breaks, and patients admitted they sometimes swore they felt colder drafts, even when windows were sealed. It was the wing people mentioned in hushed tones, always adding, "Strange things happen there." The ward's history was not spotless. Decades earlier, a fire had broken out in a different part of the hospital, killing several patients and a handful of staff. Though the building had been renovated, some said the smoke stains never fully left the walls. Others claimed the screams of the trapped could still be heard during quiet nights, carried down hallways like echoes caught in a loop. Administrators denied these tales, of course, but they spread from one generation of staff to the next, growing darker with each retelling. The patients currently in the ward were a mix of people from different walks of life. There was a retired schoolteacher battling pneumonia, a young man recovering from an accident, a middle-aged woman with heart complications, and several others, each carrying their own private struggles. Though strangers, they shared the fragile bond of illness, of being tethered to machines and medications while the rest of the world carried on outside. Some had families who visited faithfully, bringing flowers and warm smiles. Others were alone, their only company the steady rhythm of the machines by their bedside. Nurses did their best to bring comfort, offering small kindnesses, a warm blanket, a hand held during difficult nights, but even they seemed stretched thin. Beneath their professionalism, there was a weariness, a heaviness in their eyes. Working in this ward felt different, as though a constant pressure lingered in the air, pressing against their chests. Some whispered about seeing shadows moving where none should be, or feeling watched while walking alone during night shifts. One young nurse once confessed she hated passing room 12, claiming the door handle felt icy cold every time she touched it, even in summer. The hospital administration treated such stories as superstition. They pushed for silence, instructing staff to remain professional and never feed into rumors. Yet silence only made the tension worse. For those who worked long nights in the ward, the building seemed alive, breathing quietly, its walls absorbing secrets. And patients, often left staring at the ceiling for hours, swore they could hear faint footsteps pacing outside their rooms, even when the halls were empty. Families of the patients sometimes caught glimpses of this atmosphere when they visited. A mother bringing food for her son once remarked that the air in the ward felt heavy, as if she were walking into a storm about to break. Another relative described it as the kind of place you leave and never want to return to. Visitors often hurried their goodbyes, unsettled by something they couldn't quite name. Still, despite the whispers and the unease, life inside the hospital carried on as it always had. Meals were served, medicine distributed, and patients drifted in and out of restless sleep. To anyone on the outside, this was just another hospital fighting its daily battles. But for those inside, especially in that wing, there was always the unshakable sense that something unseen moved just beyond the edge of perception. The night after the patients shared their strange, identical dream, this sense deepened. Conversations among the staff turned nervous, laughter cut short, smiles forced. Nurses tried to dismiss it as stress, as coincidence, but unease lingered in their glances. Patients clutched blankets tighter, reluctant to sleep. And the building itself seemed to groan more than usual, as if it, too, was holding its breath. No one yet knew that the dream was only the beginning. The whispers that had haunted the ward for years were about to return in full force, not as rumors but as reality. And when they did, the shadows of the hospital would no longer remain confined to stories, they would step out into the light. Morning in the ward was usually predictable. Nurses made their rounds, doctors checked charts, and patients tried to distract themselves with newspapers or the glow of a small television fixed high on the wall. But on this particular morning, something felt different. Conversations were sharper, laughter forced, and the usual routine carried a heaviness that couldn't be explained by illness alone. It started with a single patient, the retired schoolteacher, who spoke timidly about the strange dream she had the night before. Her words were hesitant, almost embarrassed, as though she feared ridicule. But as she described the long hallway, the flickering lights, and the faceless figure waiting at the end, others froze in silence. Because they had seen it too. One by one, patients joined in, their voices growing more urgent, more insistent. Each detail aligned, down to the sound of the lights buzzing overhead and the exact phrase whispered in the dark, "It's time." No matter how different their lives, their ages, or their conditions, their dreams had been identical, like pages copied from the same book. Nurses overheard the conversation and at first dismissed it with gentle smiles, suggesting stress, medication side effects, or the natural fears that come with sickness. But when they compared notes later, their faces betrayed unease. This wasn't the usual anxious dreaming of patients confined to hospital beds. The details were too precise, too consistent, and too impossible. That night, dread settled over the ward. Some patients refused to sleep, forcing their eyes open until exhaustion overcame them. A young man recovering from his accident begged the staff for extra coffee, desperate to avoid drifting off. Another woman clutched her prayer beads tightly, whispering verses until her lips trembled with fatigue. The atmosphere was tense, filled with the silent understanding that if they dreamed again, it would not be just another harmless vision. It felt like an invitation, one none of them wanted to accept. And yet, the dream returned. Those who fought to stay awake eventually lost the battle. As their eyelids grew heavy and their breathing slowed, they slipped back into the same endless hallway. Some described feeling watched from the walls themselves, as though unseen eyes followed every step. The faceless figure stood waiting, its presence heavier than before, closer somehow. This time, the voice was clearer, almost intimate, whispering not to a group but to each person individually, "It's time." When they awoke, the panic was worse. Several screamed, startling nurses who rushed to calm them. The young man who had begged for coffee sat upright in his bed, shaking uncontrollably, insisting that the figure had stepped closer. "It was right in front of me," he stammered, "I could feel it breathing." His terror was so raw that even the most skeptical staff found themselves chilled. As the days passed, the shared dream consumed the ward. Patients compared experiences like pieces of a puzzle, though each story only deepened their fear. One claimed the figure had raised its hand as though reaching out. Another swore the voice now sounded familiar, almost like someone they once knew but couldn't quite place. The dreams were no longer identical in every detail, they were evolving, changing as if the figure itself was responding to their fear. Doctors began to take note when even the strongest patients showed signs of sleep deprivation. Bags darkened under their eyes, hands shook, tempers flared. Their medical charts reflected declining health that couldn't be explained by their original diagnoses. Nurses, too, whispered among themselves, admitting they felt reluctant to enter the ward alone at night. Several reported strange occurrences, monitors flickering for no reason, call buttons activating with no one pressing them, the faint sound of footsteps pacing the hallway long after visiting hours had ended. The breaking point came when one patient, determined to resist the dream, forced himself to stay awake for nearly 2 days. His eyes were bloodshot, his words slurred, but he refused to sleep. The staff tried to calm him, warning that exhaustion could trigger a medical crisis, but he was adamant. "If I sleep, it'll take me," he whispered. Eventually, his body gave out. He slipped into unconsciousness in the middle of the night, his chest rising and falling in labored breaths. Moments later, his screams shattered the silence of the ward. Nurses rushed to his bedside, certain he was seizing, but his body was rigid, his eyes wide open, staring at something none of them could see. "It's here," he gasped, his voice raw, desperate. "It's in the room." The staff restrained him, calming him as best they could, but the terror in his face never left them. To him, the figure from the hallway had followed him out of the dream and into waking life. For the others, this was the final confirmation. Whatever was happening wasn't just in their heads. The dream was spreading, growing stronger, and breaking through the fragile barrier between sleep and reality. Patients clung to each other now, no longer comforted by daylight, no longer reassured by the presence of staff. Sleep had become a trap, and no one knew how long they could avoid it. By the end of the week, the ward had transformed from a place of recovery into a chamber of dread. Doctors had no explanation, nurses no comfort. Families noticed the change in their loved ones and began asking questions, but the truth was too bizarre to share. And through it all, the dream figure lingered, closer, clearer, and more terrifying than ever. The ward was no longer united by illness. It was united by fear of the same faceless figure, waiting at the end of the hallway, whispering those same words, "It's time." And soon, those words would no longer be confined to sleep. At first, no one truly believed the dreams could have consequences in the waking world. They were terrifying, yes, and vivid enough to leave patients trembling long after dawn, but dreams were supposed to stay inside the mind. That belief shattered the moment the first patient vanished. It happened quietly, without warning. A young man who had been recovering from a car accident was there one moment and gone the next. His bed was still warm, his 4-drip still attached, its needle dangling uselessly against the sheets. Nurses conducting their morning rounds found the bed empty and assumed he had been transferred for tests. But when they checked the logs, there was nothing, no paperwork, no authorization, no trace of where he had gone. Security cameras showed only an unbroken feed of static during the exact hours he disappeared. Whispers spread through the ward with lightning speed. The patients knew, deep down, what had happened, even if they refused to say it aloud. The dream had claimed him. Staff tried to calm the others, offering rational explanations, but the fear in the patients' eyes could not be soothed. To them, the vanishing confirmed everything they had been dreading. The figure from the hallway was real, and it was taking them one by one. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, it was the retired schoolteacher. She had confided earlier that day that the figure in the dream was closer than ever, so close she could almost make out the shape of its hand. That night, she screamed just once, a short, piercing cry that echoed down the corridor, and then silence. By the time nurses rushed to her room, the bed was empty, sheets crumpled as though she had simply risen and walked away. Her rosary lay broken on the floor, beads scattered like tiny marbles across the tiles. Once again, the cameras caught nothing but distortion. The disappearances began to erode the fragile stability of the ward. Nurses worked in pairs, too afraid to check rooms alone. Families grew restless, demanding to know why their loved ones looked so hollow-eyed and terrified, and why 2 patients had mysteriously gone missing in less than a week. Administrators scrambled for answers, issuing bland reassurances about routine transfers and temporary relocations, but their hollow words only fueled suspicion. The truth was obvious: something was happening inside that ward, and no one could stop it. The patients clung to each other, united by fear. Some refused to sleep at all, choosing instead to talk through the night, their voices trembling as they kept each other awake. Others gave up, closing their eyes with resignation, whispering that resistance was useless. Every time someone drifted into unconsciousness, the others waited with bated breath, unsure if they would ever wake again. The third disappearance struck harder than the rest because it wasn't just a patient. It was a nurse. She had been on the night shift, making rounds, when she vanished mid-duty. Her clipboard was later found in the middle of the hallway, a pen snapped in 2 beside it. Another nurse swore she saw her being led away by someone dressed in white, but when she followed, the hallway was empty, stretching out into darkness. That detail unsettled the staff more than anything else, because all of them wore white. Panic began to ripple through the hospital. Families threatened lawsuits, doctors demanded explanations, and security doubled their efforts. Guards were stationed outside the ward, their flashlights cutting through the dim corridors, but even their presence offered little comfort. Fear had burrowed too deep. Patients whispered about the figure in the dream now walking among them, slipping between the rooms unnoticed, choosing its next victim. One of the remaining patients described a new detail the following morning. In the dream, the figure had spoken more clearly, and this time, it had called her by name. Her voice broke as she recounted it, tears streaming down her face. No one laughed. No one dismissed it. Because deep down, everyone feared the same thing, that the disappearances weren't random. The figure was choosing. By now, the staff no longer dismissed the dreams as delusions. They began recording testimonies, desperate to find a pattern. But each night, more beds grew empty. The disappearances accelerated, 2 patients gone in one night, then 3 the next. No signs of forced entry, no alarms, no evidence of anyone leaving. Just silence, warm sheets, and absence. The building itself seemed to respond, its groans louder, its shadows darker. Even the air felt heavier, as if the ward was suffocating under an unseen weight. Fear spread beyond the ward, spilling into the rest of the hospital. Other patients begged not to be moved there, staff called in sick rather than take the night shift, and rumors reached the town outside, rumors of a cursed ward where people vanished into thin air. Administrators fought to suppress the stories, insisting that everything was under control. But behind closed doors, their meetings grew frantic. They couldn't explain the disappearances, couldn't reassure the families, and couldn't prevent the growing sense that the hospital was slipping into chaos. What had begun as whispers was now a crisis. And yet, despite the mounting terror, the disappearances continued. Each night, someone else was taken, leaving behind nothing but silence and fear. The faceless figure from the dream was no longer confined to nightmares. It had crossed into reality, moving through the ward with purpose. And as the numbers dwindled, everyone knew the question was no longer if it would strike again, but who would be next. By the time the 4th disappearance occurred, local authorities were forced to take notice. Families of the missing patients had grown desperate, calling the police repeatedly, demanding answers. News of the unusual pattern began circulating, first quietly, then with increasing urgency, drawing reporters to the hospital doors, cameras and microphones in tow. Inside, the ward had transformed from a place of healing into a chamber of tension, each creak of the floorboards echoing like a warning. Detectives arrived and began their investigations systematically, reviewing security footage, interviewing staff, and speaking with the families. They were methodical, trained to look for patterns, motives, and means. But the ward resisted their scrutiny. The cameras seemed to malfunction precisely at the moments when patients disappeared, footage cutting abruptly to static, leaving investigators with nothing to examine. Witnesses were terrified, often refusing to speak at first, and those who did recounted stories so surreal that detectives struggled to maintain professional composure. Tales of shared dreams, faceless figures, and whispered warnings blurred the line between reality and hysteria. Doctors and nurses were questioned individually. Some offered calm, clinical explanations, attributing the events to sleepwalking, delusions, or the stress of illness. But as interviews progressed, contradictions emerged. One nurse swore she saw a patient rise from a bed and walk toward the hallway, yet there was no sign of movement on the floor's security cameras. A doctor admitted noticing subtle, unexplained changes in patients' vital signs prior to their vanishings, yet could not explain why these anomalies coincided with the dream descriptions. The detectives began poring over hospital records, hoping to uncover a pattern in admissions or medical history. That's when they stumbled upon older case files, long forgotten in a dusty storage room. These files documented previous disappearances in the same ward, dating back decades. Patients had vanished under similarly mysterious circumstances, often following reports of nightmares, unusual visions, or hallucinations. The dates were spread across years, yet the details echoed one another with uncanny similarity, the timing, the descriptions of faceless figures, and the eerily consistent phrase, "It's time." The investigators' skepticism began to waver. Rational explanations seemed increasingly insufficient. Sleep disorders, psychiatric complications, or medication side effects could not account for multiple, simultaneous disappearances with no physical evidence. Even the hospital administrators, once adamant about controlling the narrative, appeared shaken as they confronted the pattern of missing patients stretching back generations. Rumors began to surface among the hospital staff, whispered cautiously in break rooms and stairwells. Some spoke of shadows moving where none should be, cold drafts that made skin crawl, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. A handful of nurses reported seeing a figure in the halls, blurred and faceless, moving silently past rooms. While initially dismissed as tired imagination, these accounts, coupled with the missing patients, fueled the growing belief that something beyond conventional explanation was at play. Then, something unprecedented occurred. One of the lead investigators, a veteran detective with decades of experience and a reputation for unwavering rationality, began experiencing the dream himself. He awoke in the middle of the night, gasping, disoriented, and haunted by the same hallway, the flickering lights, and the faceless figure. The voice, whispering, "It's time," resonated deep within him, leaving him trembling. He had no prior connection to the ward or its patients, yet the dream had found him. The revelation shook the team to its core. If an outsider, with no medical or personal ties, could be drawn into this shared experience, then the phenomenon extended beyond the hospital walls. The investigation now faced a dilemma: how could one contain or explain an event that seemed to transcend both logic and reality? Detectives began mapping out the patterns of disappearance, interviewing families and staff repeatedly, trying to identify correlations. The more they investigated, the more anomalies they encountered. Security footage was consistently unreliable during critical moments. Witnesses recounted seeing the missing patients just moments before vanishing, often walking calmly as if guided by an unseen hand. The timelines did not add up, and every explanation offered only led to more questions. Within the ward, tension escalated. Patients who remained awake shared their fears, quietly confiding that each dream seemed to grow more elaborate, more insistent. Some recounted glimpses of the faceless figure outside their rooms, though no one else saw it. Staff, once confident in their routines, now walked the halls with heightened vigilance, their unease mirrored in every shadow and flickering light. The investigation had opened a door to something far greater than a series of random disappearances. It had uncovered a pattern, one stretching back decades, that linked dreams, vanished patients, and inexplicable phenomena. And yet, for all the meticulous work and questioning, the detectives were no closer to understanding the force at play. With each unanswered question, the ward's grip on reality tightened, and the faceless figure waiting at the end of the hallway seemed poised to claim its next victim. By now, the line between dream and reality was dangerously thin. Investigators, staff, and patients alike felt it, the sense that the events were not bound by ordinary laws, and that any moment, the next disappearance could happen right before their eyes. The ward was no longer merely a place of care, it had become the epicenter of a mystery that defied explanation, a living puzzle that would test reason, faith, and sanity alike. And just as the detectives began to grasp the depth of the enigma, a chilling thought took root: the dream was not just a warning, it was a guide. Whoever, or whatever, orchestrated the vanishings was patient, methodical, and growing bolder. And soon, it would show its full hand. As the investigation deepened, detectives and journalists began digging into the hospital's history, hoping to uncover any clues that could explain the unexplainable. What they found was a web of incidents stretching back decades, incidents that blurred the line between tragedy and legend. Old newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile, told stories of patients who had vanished without a trace, of nights when entire wings seemed to fall silent and staff reported seeing figures in the corridors that no one could identify. Each account was fragmented, often dismissed as rumor, yet the similarities to the current events were impossible to ignore. Locals whispered about the land on which the hospital was built. Long before the concrete and steel, they said, it had been the site of an old orphanage, then later a small sanatorium, where stories of patients seeing impossible visions were common. According to town folklore, a collector of souls haunted the grounds, a shadowy entity that preyed on the vulnerable and the ill. At first, investigators were skeptical, dismissing such claims as superstition. But when they cross-referenced these stories with hospital records, unsettling parallels emerged. Patterns of disappearances, dreams of long hallways, and faceless figures stretching across decades suggested that the legend might not be entirely fictional. One old newspaper article caught the attention of a seasoned detective. It described a fire decades earlier in a psychiatric ward that once occupied part of the hospital grounds. Several patients had died, and survivors recounted seeing the same hallway from the recent dreams, long and dimly lit, ending in a faceless figure that whispered words they could not comprehend. Witnesses at the time had been dismissed as delusional, and the event faded from public memory. Yet now, the details echoed exactly what the current patients were experiencing. The past and present seemed to be colliding, as though history was repeating itself with eerie precision. The urban legends surrounding the hospital were no longer just stories told by nervous townsfolk. Staff members, both current and retired, began sharing their own experiences. A former nurse, now in her 70s, described tending to patients who claimed to see shadows moving through walls. One patient, she recalled, had drawn the same hallway she now realized the new patients were dreaming of. "I thought they were imagining things," she admitted. "But now, I don't know what to think." Her voice trembled with the weight of memory. Families of the missing patients also recounted strange occurrences predating the vanishings. Dreams similar to those described by the patients had been reported to them, sometimes years earlier. One relative told investigators that a child in the family, now an adult, had insisted on avoiding sleep during a particularly dark night, describing a faceless figure calling their name. The detectives realized that these events were not confined to the hospital or even the current generation. They had threads running through time, connecting people and experiences in ways that defied reason. For some, the ward's shadow had followed them home, a haunting that refused to fade. Families of the vanished lived in perpetual uncertainty. Without bodies or evidence, there was no closure, no funeral, and no way to mourn properly. Daily routines were interrupted by recurring nightmares, each echoing the same whispered phrase, "It's time." Grief merged with dread, and for many, the disappearance became a permanent scar on their lives. The absence of their loved ones was not just physical, it was metaphysical, a reminder that something beyond comprehension had intervened and refused to let go. Media coverage continued, oscillating between sensationalism and careful reporting. Investigative journalists documented the history of the ward, uncovering decades of similar incidents. The public was fascinated and horrified, drawing attention from paranormal researchers, historians, and conspiracy theorists alike. Online forums buzzed with speculation, with countless individuals sharing their own experiences of inexplicable dreams or missing relatives in hospitals, forming a virtual archive of fear and fascination. The story of the vanishing ward became both cautionary tale and legend, captivating audiences who debated endlessly over the nature of the phenomenon. In official terms, authorities closed the case as unexplained disappearances, a euphemism that satisfied no one. Legal proceedings were minimal, constrained by the lack of physical evidence. Investigators remained frustrated, knowing that traditional methods of inquiry could not solve what had occurred. Their reports documented patterns, interviews, and anomalies, but they concluded with the unnerving acknowledgement that the events transcended conventional understanding. The vanishing ward defied the rules of both law and science, existing in a liminal space between the comprehensible and the impossible. The hospital itself became a place of quiet dread. Even after renovations and staff changes, the corridors of the fourth-floor wing remained avoided. Stories of cold drafts, whispered voices, and flickering lights persisted. New employees were warned discreetly by seasoned staff, and patients in other wards occasionally reported glimpses of shadowy figures moving in empty hallways. Though no disappearances occurred again at the same scale, the aura of the vanishing ward lingered, like a bruise on the building, reminding all who entered that it was not entirely safe to assume reality would remain intact. Psychologists and paranormal theorists alike continued to debate the events. Was it mass hysteria? A residual spiritual presence? A temporal anomaly? No consensus emerged, and perhaps none could. The vanishing ward had become a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of human perception and the unknowable forces that can intersect with everyday life. Its legacy was cemented not in explanations, but in fear, memory, and unanswered questions. In the end, the ward stood silent, empty, and impenetrable. Machines lay idle, beds stripped, and corridors dim. Yet the whispers of its history, the echoes of vanished patients, and the chilling refrain of "It's time," remained, invisible but undeniable. For those who had witnessed it, who had felt the presence, or who had merely heard the stories, the vanishing ward became more than a location, it became an enduring enigma, a dark chapter in human experience, and a haunting reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Even today, locals warn visitors to avoid the hospital's fourth floor, and stories circulate about fleeting shadows and unexplained cold spots. The disappearances are long past, but the memory persists, feeding into the collective consciousness of fear. The vanishing ward had not only claimed the patients, it had claimed certainty, leaving behind only the haunting knowledge that the boundary between sleep and waking, between life and disappearance, is far thinner than anyone could have imagined. The deeper they delved, the more patterns emerged. The figure in the dreams always appeared at the end of a long hallway. The whispered phrase, "It's time," recurred in every account. Patients vanished during or immediately after these dreams, and the phenomenon seemed to skip no one within the ward. The investigators couldn't determine whether it was supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely. But the historical parallels were undeniable. The hospital was not merely the site of these events, it was part of a continuum, a place where fear and the unknown had long held sway. Even the architecture of the hospital seemed to play a role. Old floor plans revealed hallways that twisted unnaturally, corridors that seemed to mirror each other, creating an almost labyrinthine layout. Patients reported that the hallways in their dreams matched the physical space of the ward, down to flickering lights and cold drafts. The investigators began to suspect that the building itself, or the history embedded within it, was somehow linked to the phenomenon. Amid these revelations, one narrative persisted above all: the faceless figure, ever present, ever patient, and whispering the same ominous words. Investigators began reaching out to survivors of past incidents, people who had experienced similar events but had not vanished. One elderly former nurse from the psychiatric fire survivors recalled the same dream hallway, the same figure, and the same chilling voice. She warned them, her hands shaking, that the entity had a pattern, and that its patience made it all the more dangerous. By now, the investigators were no longer just dealing with missing persons, they were confronting a legacy, a historical shadow that refused to remain buried. Every urban legend, every historical disappearance, every faint newspaper account was another piece of the puzzle. And while the evidence grew, so did the stakes. The disappearances were escalating, and it was becoming clear that the figure in the dreams was preparing for something larger than anyone had yet imagined. The ward itself, with its flickering lights and narrow hallways, felt charged with an unseen energy. Shadows seemed longer, and even the staff felt the pressure of a presence that refused to be ignored. The historical parallels made one thing frighteningly clear: this was not random. The dream, the figure, and the disappearances were all connected, a continuum that spanned decades, and it was only a matter of time before the next chapter unfolded. By the time the sixth night rolled in, the atmosphere within the ward had shifted from fear to sheer terror. Patients huddled together in small clusters, whispering frantically, their eyes darting toward every shadow that moved across the dimly lit hallways. The air felt heavier, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The staff, once confident in their routines, now moved like ghosts, their footsteps tentative and slow, glancing over shoulders as if expecting the faceless figure to emerge at any moment. Disappearance had become a nightly occurrence. Beds once filled with life now lay empty, sheets rumpled and still warm. Nurses worked in pairs, reluctant to enter rooms alone, and doctors kept detailed logs of each incident, though they knew no record could truly capture the horror unfolding before them. Security cameras, which had once been thought sufficient, now produced nothing but static during critical moments, as if the ward itself resisted being observed. Families were warned to stay away, but many insisted on visiting, clutching hope that their loved ones would somehow remain untouched. The patients remaining awake reported increasingly detailed experiences of the dream. The hallway seemed longer, more labyrinthine, and the figure at its end appeared closer, almost tangible. Some recounted feeling cold drafts brush against their skin as though the figure had stepped into the room itself. One patient, a middle-aged woman recovering from heart complications, insisted she saw a shadow moving past her window, a black, undistinguishable shape that vanished when she blinked. Her voice shook as she recounted the sight, but the staff could not dismiss her fear. She had been coherent, aware, and utterly convinced. As the vanishings continued, the ward seemed to descend into its own temporal loop. Time lost its usual rhythm. Nights stretched longer than days, and the remaining patients struggled to distinguish reality from the creeping influence of their dreams. Whispers among them suggested that the figure could move between consciousness and sleep, that resisting the dream offered no protection. For some, the ward's shadow had followed them home, a haunting that refused to fade. Families of the vanished lived in perpetual uncertainty. Without bodies or evidence, there was no closure, no funeral, and no way to mourn properly. Daily routines were interrupted by recurring nightmares, each echoing the same whispered phrase, "It's time." Grief merged with dread, and for many, the disappearance became a permanent scar on their lives. The absence of their loved ones was not just physical, it was metaphysical, a reminder that something beyond comprehension had intervened and refused to let go. Media coverage continued, oscillating between sensationalism and careful reporting. Investigative journalists documented the history of the ward, uncovering decades of similar incidents. The public was fascinated and horrified, drawing attention from paranormal researchers, historians, and conspiracy theorists alike. Online forums buzzed with speculation, with countless individuals sharing their own experiences of inexplicable dreams or missing relatives in hospitals, forming a virtual archive of fear and fascination. The story of the vanishing ward became both cautionary tale and legend, captivating audiences who debated endlessly over the nature of the phenomenon. In official terms, authorities closed the case as unexplained disappearances, a euphemism that satisfied no one. Legal proceedings were minimal, constrained by the lack of physical evidence. Investigators remained frustrated, knowing that traditional methods of inquiry could not solve what had occurred. Their reports documented patterns, interviews, and anomalies, but they concluded with the unnerving acknowledgement that the events transcended conventional understanding. The vanishing ward defied the rules of both law and science, existing in a liminal space between the comprehensible and the impossible. The hospital itself became a place of quiet dread. Even after renovations and staff changes, the corridors of the fourth-floor wing remained avoided. Stories of cold drafts, whispered voices, and flickering lights persisted. New employees were warned discreetly by seasoned staff, and patients in other wards occasionally reported glimpses of shadowy figures moving in empty hallways. Though no disappearances occurred again at the same scale, the aura of the vanishing ward lingered, like a bruise on the building, reminding all who entered that it was not entirely safe to assume reality would remain intact. Psychologists and paranormal theorists alike continued to debate the events. Was it mass hysteria? A residual spiritual presence? A temporal anomaly? No consensus emerged, and perhaps none could. The vanishing ward had become a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of human perception and the unknowable forces that can intersect with everyday life. Its legacy was cemented not in explanations, but in fear, memory, and unanswered questions. In the end, the ward stood silent, empty, and impenetrable. Machines lay idle, beds stripped, and corridors dim. Yet the whispers of its history, the echoes of vanished patients, and the chilling refrain of "It's time" remained, invisible but undeniable. For those who had witnessed it, who had felt the presence, or who had merely heard the stories, the vanishing ward became more than a location, it became an enduring enigma, a dark chapter in human experience, and a haunting reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Even today, locals warn visitors to avoid the hospital's fourth floor, and stories circulate about fleeting shadows and unexplained cold spots. The disappearances are long past, but the memory persists, feeding into the collective consciousness of fear. The vanishing ward had not only claimed the patients, it had claimed certainty, leaving behind only the haunting knowledge that the boundary between sleep and waking, between life and disappearance, is far thinner than anyone could have imagined. The hospital, once a place of healing, now felt like a trap, with walls closing in and corridors stretching into infinity. Detectives stationed inside the ward attempted to monitor every room, taking turns staying awake, but even they were not immune. One investigator, whose skepticism had long defined his career, began recording his own observations. His notes became frantic as he described fleeting glimpses of figures where none should be, sounds of footsteps echoing in empty halls, and shadows moving against the grain of light. Cameras and sensors failed to detect these intrusions, and soon, even the most rational observers were forced to question their senses. The escalation was not just in the number of disappearances but in the audacity of the entity itself. Entire rooms would be found empty at once, patients vanishing simultaneously, leaving nothing but the faintest imprint on mattresses, as if the air itself had swallowed them. Staff who tried to intervene often reported sudden chills, dizziness, or the overwhelming sensation of being watched. Panic spread like wildfire, infecting every corner of the ward. Families, once hopeful, now approached with dread. Visitors who had come in the day before would receive vague reassurances from staff, yet by evening, they were confronted with empty beds and unanswered questions. The hospital administration attempted to maintain order, issuing statements that spoke of transfers and administrative errors, but their words rang hollow against the mounting evidence of something far more sinister. Amid the chaos, a disturbing realization emerged: the figures seemed to be learning, adapting, and targeting selectively. Patients who had tried to resist sleep or avoid the hallways in their dreams were still claimed, suggesting that no amount of willpower could shield them. Even staff members stationed for protection felt the presence, an invisible pressure that tightened like a vice around their chests, leaving them anxious and on edge. By the seventh night, the ward had transformed entirely. It was no longer a place of care but a domain of fear, where the line between life and disappearance blurred. Investigators, nurses, and patients alike understood that the entity's influence was escalating, growing stronger with each passing moment. Every flickering light, every creaking floorboard, became a reminder that the faceless figure's reach was limitless, and that the ward itself was a stage for something beyond comprehension. The climax was approaching, though no one could pinpoint when or how it would strike. All that remained certain was the unshakable knowledge that each moment of calm was only temporary, a fragile illusion waiting to shatter. And in the darkness, the faceless figure waited, patient and inevitable, preparing to claim the next group of victims. The vanishing ward was no longer merely haunted, it had become a trap, a labyrinth of fear from which escape seemed impossible. Every heartbeat, every whisper, every flicker of light now carried the same message: the dream was not merely a vision. It was a warning, a map, and a prelude to something far more terrifying than anyone within those walls had yet experienced. The final night arrived with a silence that was almost unnatural. The ward, already steeped in fear and tension, seemed to hold its breath. Patients clung to each other in whispered conversation, their voices shaking with anticipation and terror. Nurses moved cautiously, their flashlights casting long, trembling shadows across the hallways. Even the detectives who had been stationed inside for days felt an unfamiliar heaviness, as if the very air resisted movement. Every sound, from the faint hum of machines to the distant creak of the pipes, seemed amplified, warning that something monumental was about to unfold. The remaining patients had long since stopped trying to fight the inevitable. Sleep had become both a necessity and a curse, a doorway that none could avoid. Some lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hands tightly clasped, refusing to close their eyes. Others, exhausted and trembling, finally succumbed, sinking into the same shared nightmare that had haunted them for days. And the figure awaited them, patient, indistinct, yet undeniably present at the end of the endless hallway that existed both in dreams and, somehow, in reality. As the hours passed, the ward became a landscape of shadow and fear. The faceless figure's presence seemed to infiltrate the very walls. Patients described feeling cold air brush past their skin, faint whispers calling their names, and the impossible sensation of being watched from every corner simultaneously. Some tried to speak, to warn others, but their voices trembled and faltered. Others simply clutched at the sheets, eyes wide, sensing that the final moment of reckoning was drawing near. Then, one by one, the disappearances began. It was subtle at first. A patient would rise from a bed, almost imperceptibly, as though following an invisible guide. Staff members, standing mere feet away, would look up and find the bed empty. Sheets remained warm, as if the person had been there moments before. The detectives, cameras ready, could record nothing. Footage once again gave way to static, reinforcing the sense that the ward itself resisted observation. The atmosphere shifted from fear to chaos. Nurses attempted to follow the disappearing patients, but the hallways twisted unnaturally, and the flickering light seemed to create illusions of movement, disorienting anyone who tried to intervene. The patients, almost in unison, reported hearing the figure calling their names, urging them forward, a voice both gentle and commanding. They rose obediently, as if compelled, walking into the unseen presence that awaited at the end of the dream hallway. Families outside waited anxiously, unaware of the magnitude unfolding within. One relative described a growing unease, the feeling that time itself had stretched and thickened. Messages sent to hospital staff went unanswered, phones rang endlessly, and the city's emergency lines were inundated with frantic calls. Inside the ward, however, no outside interference could halt the progression of events. The figure's reach had become absolute, claiming every remaining patient with a precision that defied reason. By midnight, the ward was nearly empty. Only a handful of staff remained, standing frozen in hallways once lined with beds. Every room was vacant, machines beeped steadily without responding to any living patient. The detectives and nurses looked at each other in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had occurred. The building itself seemed to pulse, as if exhaling a long-held breath, leaving an emptiness that was almost tangible. One nurse, who had witnessed the events from the hallway, described the final moments in vivid detail. She claimed that all remaining patients had risen simultaneously, moving toward the central corridor as though drawn by an unseen magnet. The faceless figure appeared at the end, its presence commanding, shadowy, and impossible to define. It did not touch them, yet they were gone, leaving only silence and the faintest trace of warmth where they had once been. Among the chaos, a single journal left behind by an investigator captured the horror of the moment. The hallway is here. I can hear the lights flickering. They walk willingly. There is no struggle. It's as though the world itself bends to it. If we are not careful, we will be next. The words trembled across the page, a testament to fear too profound for rational explanation. By dawn, the ward stood completely empty. Every patient had vanished. No trace remained, no evidence, no explanation, no closure. The building, once alive with machines, whispers, and fragile hope, was silent. Administrators, detectives, and staff were left to stare at empty rooms, haunted by the certainty that whatever had occurred was beyond understanding. The final night had completed the ward's transformation. It was no longer a place of care, of recovery, or of life. It had become a threshold, a liminal space where dreams crossed into reality and where the faceless figure reigned supreme. And though the building now seemed inert, the echoes of its terrors lingered, suggesting that the nightmare was far from over, and that the figure, patient and inevitable, was only waiting for the next opportunity to claim more souls. In the aftermath of the final night, the ward became a nexus of unanswered questions, speculation, and fear. Investigators, doctors, and remaining staff struggled to make sense of what had transpired. How could an entire group of patients vanish without a trace? How could dreams manifest into such absolute reality? Rational explanations faltered, and every theory carried its own discomforting implications. The air in the hospital remained heavy, charged with an invisible tension, as if the building itself remembered the events and bore silent witness. Medical experts were the first to propose conventional explanations. Sleep disorders, psychological contagion, and mass hysteria were all considered. Some hypothesized that extreme stress and shared anxiety had created a collective hallucination so powerful that patients wandered off or acted unconsciously. Others suggested a rare neurological phenomenon, perhaps triggered by medication, that somehow synchronized the patient's perceptions and behaviors. While these theories attempted to root the events in science, none could account for the lack of physical evidence: no footprints, no surveillance footage, no trace of bodies. The explanations felt hollow, insufficient against the stark reality of the disappearances. Journalists covering the story explored broader possibilities, invoking urban legends, folklore, and historical patterns. The town's whispers of a collector of souls gained new weight, as did accounts of prior incidents on the hospital grounds. Some articles speculated about malevolent entities tied to trauma and human suffering, feeding on fear and manifesting in ways beyond comprehension. Skeptics dismissed these claims as sensationalism, yet even the most skeptical reporters admitted that the consistencies across decades and testimonies were impossible to ignore. The figure in the hallway was no longer a story, it was a pattern, a repeating phenomenon that defied ordinary understanding. Conspiracy theories also emerged. Some suggested the hospital had been conducting secret experiments, manipulating patients in ways that could induce sleepwalking, altered states, or hallucinations. Documents and past cases hinted at questionable practices, though investigators found nothing concrete linking them to the disappearances. Another theory posited that the hospital's architecture itself played a role, a labyrinthine design, steeped in history and trauma, that somehow warped perception and guided victims toward an invisible force. These speculations spread quickly, fueled by fear and the lack of answers, leaving residents unsure whom or what to believe. Paranormal investigators were called in, though reluctantly by the authorities. They reported an overwhelming presence of what they described as non-corporeal consciousness, tied to residual trauma and collective fear. Some claimed the faceless figure was an embodiment of all the hospital's historical tragedies, feeding on vulnerability and manifesting physically during periods of extreme stress. These claims were controversial, dismissed by the scientific community, but they provided a narrative that fit the terrifying consistency of events. According to these specialists, the ward had become a focal point, a threshold where dream and reality converged, and where human perception was powerless to resist. Families, desperate for closure, clung to any explanation. Some sought spiritual guidance, invoking prayers and rituals to understand or counter the phenomenon. Others retreated into silence, unable to process the enormity of the loss. The disappearances had not only claimed lives, they had shattered trust in institutions, in medicine, and in the boundary between waking and dreaming. Every theory, every speculation, carried the unspoken acknowledgement that the ward's events had transcended ordinary human understanding. Even among experts, one realization became unavoidable: whatever had occurred in the ward was not an isolated event. It was part of a continuum, echoing decades of historical patterns, urban legends, and inexplicable vanishings. The faceless figure, the shared dreams, and the disappearances were bound together, a cycle that had repeated across time and would likely continue unless something fundamentally altered its course. As the world tried to process the impossible, investigators and staff were left with lingering dread. Theories provided structure but no solace. Speculations explained little and frightened much. And through it all, one truth remained undeniable: the vanishing ward had claimed its victims, and the faceless figure, patient, methodical, and omnipresent, had proven that some forces defy logic, science, and reason, leaving only silence and the weight of unanswered questions behind. In the weeks following the disappearances, the hospital struggled to return to any semblance of normalcy. Administrators closed the ward indefinitely, locking the doors and removing beds, yet the emptiness felt less like absence and more like a wound in the building itself. Staff who remained haunted the corridors with wary glances, reluctant to enter even the adjacent halls. The air carried an invisible weight, a reminder that the vanishing ward had claimed more than bodies. It had claimed a sense of safety, a foundation of trust, and the illusion that life within those walls was predictable. The remaining staff were deeply affected, many unable to continue working. Nurses reported recurring dreams mirroring those that had taken the patients, leaving them shaken during shifts. Doctors described moments of déjà vu, sensing shadows moving just beyond their peripheral vision, and feeling that the faceless figure had left an indelible mark on the hospital. Psychological evaluations revealed lingering trauma among those who had witnessed the disappearances firsthand, including severe anxiety, sleep disorders, and a pervasive fear of enclosed spaces. For some, the ward's shadow had followed them home, a haunting that refused to fade. Families of the vanished lived in perpetual uncertainty. Without bodies or evidence, there was no closure, no funeral, and no way to mourn properly. Daily routines were interrupted by recurring nightmares, each echoing the same whispered phrase, "It's time." Grief merged with dread, and for many, the disappearance became a permanent scar on their lives. The absence of their loved ones was not just physical, it was metaphysical, a reminder that something beyond comprehension had intervened and refused to let go. Media coverage continued, oscillating between sensationalism and careful reporting. Investigative journalists documented the history of the ward, uncovering decades of similar incidents. The public was fascinated and horrified, drawing attention from paranormal researchers, historians, and conspiracy theorists alike. Online forums buzzed with speculation, with countless individuals sharing their own experiences of inexplicable dreams or missing relatives in hospitals, forming a virtual archive of fear and fascination. The story of the vanishing ward became both cautionary tale and legend, captivating audiences who debated endlessly over the nature of the phenomenon. In official terms, authorities closed the case as unexplained disappearances, a euphemism that satisfied no one. Legal proceedings were minimal, constrained by the lack of physical evidence. Investigators remained frustrated, knowing that traditional methods of inquiry could not solve what had occurred. Their reports documented patterns, interviews, and anomalies, but they concluded with the unnerving acknowledgement that the events transcended conventional understanding. The vanishing ward defied the rules of both law and science, existing in a liminal space between the comprehensible and the impossible. The hospital itself became a place of quiet dread. Even after renovations and staff changes, the corridors of the fourth-floor wing remained avoided. Stories of cold drafts, whispered voices, and flickering lights persisted. New employees were warned discreetly by seasoned staff, and patients in other wards occasionally reported glimpses of shadowy figures moving in empty hallways. Though no disappearances occurred again at the same scale, the aura of the vanishing ward lingered, like a bruise on the building, reminding all who entered that it was not entirely safe to assume reality would remain intact. Psychologists and paranormal theorists alike continued to debate the events. Was it mass hysteria? A residual spiritual presence? A temporal anomaly? No consensus emerged, and perhaps none could. The vanishing ward had become a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of human perception and the unknowable forces that can intersect with everyday life. Its legacy was cemented not in explanations, but in fear, memory, and unanswered questions. In the end, the ward stood silent, empty, and impenetrable. Machines lay idle, beds stripped, and corridors dim. Yet the whispers of its history, the echoes of vanished patients, and the chilling refrain of "It's time," remained, invisible but undeniable. For those who had witnessed it, who had felt the presence, or who had merely heard the stories, the vanishing ward became more than a location, it became an enduring enigma, a dark chapter in human experience, and a haunting reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Even today, locals warn visitors to avoid the hospital's fourth floor, and stories circulate about fleeting shadows and unexplained cold spots. The disappearances are long past, but the memory persists, feeding into the collective consciousness of fear. The vanishing ward had not only claimed the patients, it had claimed certainty, leaving behind only the haunting knowledge that the boundary between sleep and waking, between life and disappearance, is far thinner than anyone could have imagined. Years after the events, the vanishing ward had become a whispered legend, both inside and outside the hospital. Administrators tried to move on, renovating the building and repurposing adjacent wards, but the fourth floor remained untouched, its doors locked and its corridors silent. Staff avoided speaking of the events aloud, and new employees were given hushed warnings. The ward had become a symbol of the unknown, a place where rational explanation failed and fear persisted as a permanent resident. Its legacy was not in medical records or legal documents but in the pervasive sense of dread that hung over anyone who approached. Families of the disappeared continued to live with uncertainty. Without bodies or closure, grief became intertwined with terror. Some moved away, unable to face reminders of the vanished loved ones. Others reported recurring dreams mirroring those from the ward, the same endless hallways and faceless figure returning to haunt their sleep. Psychologists observed a pattern of post-traumatic stress that extended beyond the hospital, noting that families and former staff shared similar symptoms: insomnia, anxiety, and the visceral fear of enclosed spaces. The vanishing ward had left a psychological scar that could not be erased, its influence stretching far beyond the physical boundaries of the building. The media, too, contributed to the enduring mythos. Documentaries, articles, and online forums dissected every detail, analyzing witness accounts and historical parallels. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed evidence of lingering energy, referencing cold spots, strange sounds, and fleeting shadows reported by visitors to the hospital years later. Historians noted patterns of disappearance on the hospital grounds dating back decades, suggesting the phenomenon might be cyclical, recurring at intervals too long to be easily recognized. The vanishing ward became both cautionary tale and obsession, captivating those drawn to the unexplainable while terrifying anyone who had encountered it firsthand. Despite the passage of time, the ward's aura remained unbroken. Employees reported subtle disturbances, lights flickering without cause, monitors activating with no input, and fleeting glimpses of shadows at the periphery of vision. Some recounted hearing the phrase, "It's time," whispered softly in empty hallways, a reminder that the events had not been entirely confined to history. The building itself seemed to hold memory, its walls retaining echoes of the vanished, making it clear that the vanishing ward was more than just a location, it was a living repository of fear. For investigators and medical professionals, the events remained an unsolved puzzle. Years of research, interviews, and analysis yielded no concrete explanations. Theories ranged from psychological contagion to supernatural presence, but none accounted fully for the precision and consistency of the disappearances. The faceless figure, the shared dreams, and the vanishing patients defied rational understanding, leaving the ward as a singular anomaly in both medical and investigative records. Its story became a reminder of the limits of human comprehension, a challenge to the assumption that every event could be explained, quantified, or controlled. Locals and urban explorers whispered stories of the ward, treating it as forbidden territory. Some claimed to feel cold drafts, hear whispers, or glimpse fleeting shadows when near its doors. Others swore that the faceless figure could be felt watching them from within, an unseen presence that transcended time. The vanishing ward had become a cultural touchstone, a dark legend tied to collective memory, fear, and fascination. Its notoriety ensured that the story lived on, retold with ever-growing dread, each retelling reinforcing the enigma and keeping the nightmare alive in the public imagination. Ultimately, the vanishing ward's true legacy was not in the missing patients or the locked rooms, but in the lingering fear it left behind. It reminded everyone who heard its story that some forces cannot be fully understood, that dreams can cross into reality, and that the boundaries between life and disappearance are more fragile than we imagine. Even today, the ward stands as a cautionary emblem, silent yet alive in memory, a place where the impossible touched the everyday, leaving behind an enduring, unshakable terror. The faceless figure, patient and eternal, remained in the stories, the dreams, and the shadows, a haunting reminder that some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but to be remembered, and feared, for generations to come.